Brunswick's Department of Natural Resources and Energy Development. And today I want to talk to you about the climate change vulnerability assessment of New Brunswick Biota that we're working on. So back in 2016, the New Brunswick provincial government released a climate change action plan. So that's been a few years ago. And back then we were assigned action number 90 in the action plan. And it reads as follows: while balancing the economy and the environment, identify and focus on the most climate vulnerable species, habitats, and landscapes as targets for adaptation action, and manage for landscape connectivity to allow for species migration. So, as I said, this came out back in 2016. So we've been kind of sitting with this project for a while that we've had, and we haven't had a lot of staff available to tackle it. However, recently we were provided some funds to take on this project. So we looked at this action and kind of got a feel for it, that it's kind of really two legs to it. We have a species aspect as well as landscape connectivity. What I want to talk to you today is the species project that we're working on. We also have some projects tackling landscape connectivity on the go, but today I'm going to talk about the vulnerability assessment we're doing. So we started looking around for what other work has been done, and part of the challenge is that we found out back in September, I believe, that we were given funds to do this project, to contract some help for it. However, it's due March 31st of 2022. So we had a pretty short window to get this project accomplished. So we had a look at other work that's gone on, and we found this report that was prepared in 2014 by Manomet Center for Conservation Sciences in Maine. And through their vulnerability assessment, they were able to assess 442 species, multiple habitat types in Maine, and that included over 100 experts that contributed to the work from academia, government, and NGOs. So we saw this project and we thought that would fit in really well with our short time frame and our overall goal to assess as many species in New Brunswick as we possibly can. So we put together a rough proposal back in September. It was to assess approximately 100 New Brunswick species, which will include species at risk, harvested species, and species of cultural significance. It will involve an estimated 50 species experts from NB government, academia, and NGOs, as well as federal governments, and even experts in other jurisdictions. It will also be carried out through a two-step process. So, as I mentioned, we got some funds to tackle this project. So we looked around for a group that is really well-versed in climate change work. And of course, we got in contact with Eastern Charlotte Waterways. Many of you may have heard of them. They're based out of Blacks Harbor in New Brunswick, and they're really one of the leading NGOs in terms of climate change related work. So they were a great partner. And as I said, this project, the final report is due March 31st, 2022. So we also needed somebody that would be okay with our really quick timeline, and ECW was up to the challenge. So I want to talk to you now about the actual project or the assessment itself and what it involves. So we're doing it through two steps. There's an online assessment portion as well as a group review, more workshop sort of second step to it. So for the online assessment, we provide experts with some climate change information that predicts climate variables for the next, I have 100 years in there, but that's incorrect. It actually only goes out to 2080. But the experts have access to a variety of maps with various climate metrics that they can review for a species that they're an expert on, and they feel confident that they can, or I shouldn't say they feel confident. I mean, that's always hard to say with climate change, but they have expertise on, and they can give us some insight into how they feel this species will make out with climate change in the future. So I have a map here on the screen, and that's a sample of one of the metrics and the maps that are available for the experts to review. So this one is maximum temperature above 25 degrees Celsius, number of days, and I believe I pulled this out for the year 2080. And the other great thing about these maps we're providing the experts is that they're broken down into really relatively good detail. So New Brunswick is broken into ecoregions, and within those ecoregions, we have eco-districts, and that's what you see the various sections the province is divided into. So for a small jurisdiction, the maps are actually into pretty good detail, we think, for this purpose. So for each species that the expert is assessing, they will be assessing the species on a variety of vulnerability traits. And these vulnerability traits, which I'm going to get into, they're broken down into categories. I also want to add that the online assessment is anonymous and reviewers cannot see each other's results. I also want to mention that when we have sent this out to experts, we provided a list of species they can assess. However, we've said, hey, if you have expertise on a species that we haven't included in our list and you feel like you could add some information about it for this assessment, please go right ahead and do it. We have an option where you can add a species of your choice. So you see these 6 groupings up at the top. These are our vulnerability trait categories. So we have habitat specificity, edge of range, environmental or physiological tolerance, interspecific or phenological dependence, mobility, and exotic pathogens or invasive species. So for each of these categories, there are a variety of vulnerability traits that relate to that categorization. So that's a lot of text on the screen, and I won't go through and read them all out, but those are the traits. So when the expert goes through and they're thinking about the species they're an expert on after they've reviewed all those maps, they can go through and select which of these traits they think, yeah, in the future, this species is going to be susceptible to this vulnerability. So vulnerability traits category scoring. So that's how these categories are scored. So when the expert goes through and does the assessment, they will get a score for each of these categories that will then be put together to form an overall score for the species. And once I go through this, I will do an example, so it might make a little bit more sense. So if no vulnerability traits are selected, then the overall category score is low. If one vulnerability trait is selected, then the category score is medium. And if 2 vulnerability traits are selected, 2 or more, then the category score is high. So when you put the categories all together, if all trait categories score low, the species receives an automatic score of low vulnerability. If 1 trait category scores high and no more than 3 trait categories score medium, then the species will receive an automatic score of medium vulnerability. And if 2 or more trait categories score high or more than 3 trait categories score medium, then the species will receive an automatic score of high vulnerability. So, like I said, let's do an example so it makes a little bit more sense. So let's say I'm assessing bears or a species like that, black bear. So I'm going to go through and I've looked at all those climate change maps, or at least the metrics that are predicted for the metrics that I think are relevant to the species I'm assessing. So I get to my trait categories, and I also want to say that in the actual assessment, it's through a Google form. So the layout is much better than what I'm showing you in this Excel spreadsheet. But you go to each category and you review the traits associated with it. So let's say I've done that and I've decided that these are the traits that black bear or whatever species would be susceptible to. So then I get a score for each of my categories. So let's say I get a medium, a high, high, medium, low, medium. So what does that produce for an overall score? I get a high vulnerability. So as I mentioned, step 1 is an online assessment. So once you've assessed your species, or the expert has, and they've scored it, they will receive an email with the score that their species has been assigned. And the great part we think about this assessment is it gives experts the option to change the score once they receive it. So let's say I assessed a species, and even with all the vulnerability traits I selected, it still came back with low vulnerability. And I'm an expert and I think, no, I don't think that's accurate. I still think that species is going to be in trouble. I have the option to change the score and put it at medium or high if I want to, and add some comments about why I think that's important. And another great thing I can do is that there's then an option for me to rate the confidence I have in that score. So if a species comes out with high vulnerability and I agree with it, I can still go and say, yeah, I do think it's highly vulnerable, but I'm not really certain. There's a lot of factors at play. So we think this will help give us more insight into the results, and we're giving people the opportunity to add additional comments to help shape the feedback they're giving us. And as I mentioned, your or the expert's vulnerability score is automatically and instantly calculated. It comes back to them in an email. And from the email, it contains a link where they get to go in and give their level of agreement with that score. They can change it, and their confidence in that score. So step 2, this is the part we haven't gotten to yet. So we're currently doing the vulnerability assessments with the experts assessing species. Our next step, which we hope to begin in middle of February, is doing some group reviews. So we're going to have results assembled for each species, and we're going to bring together some experts that we think would be helpful in working out some more detail, particularly for species that we're getting conflicting results. Let's say we have experts assess a species and 3 people say, yeah, the species has high vulnerability, and maybe 4 experts say, no, low vulnerability. That's one that we'd like to have this group workshop to talk about it further and try to get a better understanding of what's going on there. We'd also like to use this as an opportunity to assess some species that we think are important to get a view of, but perhaps we've only had one expert do an assessment. Maybe this is an opportunity to bring in some more experts that we can talk to about this species and try to get some further information. So some of the outcomes we're looking for this overall project, in addition to fulfilling the commitment that we have from Action 90 of the Climate Change Action Plan, at least the species vulnerability aspect, we want this project to just provide some insight into which species in New Brunswick are most susceptible to decline, including species of cultural significance or species that are harvested. We'd also like this to provide a ranking of our most vulnerable species at risk in the province, vulnerable to climate change. So as you know, we have species at risk, but it might be helpful to get a sense that among our species at risk, here are the ones that are probably most vulnerable to climate change. We also like to have a documented trail of rationale for how the experts assess species and the threats they face. So perhaps some point down the road, we want to understand more about what are the risks to white-tailed deer or cobblestone tiger beetle. We can go back and have a look and see where the experts, how they reviewed it, the vulnerabilities they assessed, and get a feel for what's going on there once we no longer have the access to the experts to ask. We'll also want to have the confidence ratings because we feel that's an opportunity to highlight areas of research that could be prioritized to narrow the gap in understanding. So if we have a species that's coming out with high vulnerability by several experts, but they're all giving it a low confidence rating, that's giving us a sense that like, okay, wow, they're thinking there's a high risk there, but they're not really sure in how certain that is. Maybe that's area where more research needs to be done. So I want to give you a little bit of insight on some of the species that, as of today, have been most assessed. And the assessment, I think I mentioned this, it closes February 7th, which is a Monday. So I've been kind of rallying some of our experts and sending them some emails, some of them that we know, saying, yeah, the survey is going to be closing soon. If you have some time, we'd really appreciate some assessments. So far, Canada lynx has been a very popular one for people to assess. And as you may know, it's a species at risk here in New Brunswick, as well as wood turtle. That's another species at risk, and one I'm sure you're all familiar with, Atlantic salmon. Some other species that are most popular in this assessment, we have moose, black bear, and deer. And I mean, it makes sense with charismatic megafauna and the interest in harvesting these species. We're getting a lot of feedback on them, so that's fantastic. So I want to end that by saying that if any of you are interested in participating in this vulnerability assessment, if you have some expertise that you'd like to share with us, that would be fantastic. And I can email a link to our hosts here to share with the group. We'd really appreciate any input you can provide. So thank you very much.